The Whitechapel of 2026 bears little resemblance to how it would have appeared in 1888, the year of the Jack the Ripper murders. Gleaming office blocks of glass and steel now line many of its streets. Gastropubs, hip eateries, four-star hotels and fashionable shops have replaced backstreet boozers, spit and sawdust cafes, common lodging houses, second-hand clothes emporiums and bustling street markets. Even those buildings that have survived have undergone considerable change, with houses that were once the run-down and overcrowded abodes of some of the poorest members of society now selling for upwards of £2.3 million, whilst philanthropic institutions that offered a last resort for the destitute poor now provide accommodation for students attending the likes of the London School of Economics, or have been converted into stylish apartments, the monthly rents for which far exceed the annual earnings that the average Victorian resident of the district could ever hope to attain. Some argue that the large-scale demolition and gentrification of what were effectively slum dwellings and crime-infested ghettos has been a good thing, whilst others maintain that the change has ripped the very soul out of the East End. As for the Jack the Ripper murder sites, not one of them has survived. The names of the streets in which the crimes occurred have, with one exception, been changed. The buildings that stood on them were torn down decades ago, and one of the streets simply doesn't exist anymore, its site being occupied by a modern office block. And yet, it is still possible to retrace Jack the Ripper's footsteps through the streets of the modern East End, and standing as close to the murder sites as you are now able to get, you can picture your surroundings as they would have looked on those long-ago early mornings when Martha Tabram, Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly approached them in the company of a man with murderous intent whose identity, despite over 137 years of speculation and fabrication, remains a mystery. But before setting off to visit the murder sites, it is necessary to establish exactly which of the Whitechapel murders were committed by the miscreant who is now universally known as Jack the Ripper. There is a widely held consensus that there were 5 murders in his particular killing spree, and these victims are often referred to as the canonical 5, a term coined by the late Martin Fido in the 1980s. In truth, we don't know how many victims Jack the Ripper had. How can we, since we don't know who Jack the Ripper was? I personally believe that there were 6 victims, whilst others maintain that there could have been as many as 7 or 8, and some argue for as few as 3 or 4. But for the purposes of this video, I am going to concentrate on 6 murder sites. These are George Yard, now Gunthorpe Street, where Martha Tabram was murdered on the 7th of August 1888. Bucks Row, now Durward Street, where Mary Nichols, who is often regarded as having been the first victim, met her death on the 31st of August. Hanbury Street, where the body of Annie Chapman was discovered on the 8th of September. Berner Street, now Henriques Street, where Elizabeth Stride was murdered on the 30th of September. Mitre Square, where just 45 minutes after Elizabeth Stride's body had been discovered, that of Catherine Eddowes was found by Police Constable Watkins, leading to the 30th of September becoming known as the night of the double murder or the double event. And Dorset Street, a long-vanished thoroughfare, the site of which is occupied by this modern office block, where on the 9th of November Mary Kelly was murdered in her room at 13 Miller's Court. So come with me, and let us snake our way through the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields to follow Jack the Ripper's trail of terror in the East End of 2026. We begin our journey here on Whitechapel High Street, still a busy and bustling thoroughfare, just as it was at the time of the murders, albeit none of the buildings that lined it then are still standing. It was in one of the several pubs that stood here then that Martha Tabram and Mary Ann Connolly, who was known locally by the nickname of Pearly Poll, met 2 soldiers on the night of the Bank Holiday Monday, the 6th of August 1888, and spent the remainder of the night drinking with them. At around midnight, the foursome split into couples, and Pearly Poll went with her soldier into this narrow, sinister passage, Angel Alley, which at the time was much longer than it is today, stretching as it did from Whitechapel High Street to Wentworth Street. Martha led her soldier into the equally unsalubrious George Yard, now known as Gunthorpe Street. They would have passed the White Hart, which stood, and still stands, to the left of the arched entrance into the yard, on the outer wall of which this board remembers Jack the Ripper suspect George Chapman, who worked as a barber in the basement of this pub in the late 1880s. I've made a full video on Chapman, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. Martha and the soldier would have also passed this building on the left at the southern end of Gunthorpe Street, on which the year of its construction, 1886, can still be seen emblazoned on its upper level. At the top of George Yard, again on the left where these flats now stand, there stood a tenement block known as George Yard Buildings, shown here in this photograph that was taken by Stuart Evans in the 1960s. It was on the first floor landing of the block that Martha Tabram's body was found by John Saunders Reeves, a waterside labourer who made the gruesome discovery when he came down the stairs from his top floor flat on his way to work at around 4:50 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of August. Dr. Timothy Colleen, the medic who examined the body at the scene of the crime, counted 39 stab wounds between her throat and lower abdomen and opined that the killer had used 2 blades, the majority of the wounds, he said, having been inflicted with an ordinary pocket knife, whilst the deep wound to her breast had been dealt by some long, strong instrument that could have been a sword bayonet or a dagger. Having carried out the dreadful deed, the killer had then slipped away into the darkness of George Yard and had effectively melted away into the night. The East London Advertiser summed up the impact this audacious crime had on the mood in the metropolis. The circumstances of this awful tragedy are not only surrounded with the deepest mystery, but there is also a feeling of insecurity to think that in a great city like London, the streets of which are continually patrolled by police, a woman could be foully and horribly killed, almost next to citizens sleeping peacefully in their beds, without a trace or clue being left of the villain who did the deed. Gunthorpe Street in 2026 still possesses a chilling atmosphere, and it is easy to picture Martha Tabram making her way along it, either in the company of the soldier or with a later client, completely oblivious to the murderous intent of her companion and to the danger she had placed herself in. Turning right out of Gunthorpe Street, making our way along Wentworth Street and heading right along Osborne Street, we are following the route walked by Mary Ann or Polly Nichols on the morning of Friday the 31st of August. Polly had been drinking heavily over the previous hours, and she had been ejected from a common lodging house in nearby Thrall Street because she didn't have the 4pence to pay for a bed. As Mary staggered along Osborne Street, Ellen Holland, with whom Polly had shared a room in the common lodging house, was approaching its other end from Whitechapel Road. As Ellen reached the corner of Osborne Street, she saw Mary weaving unsteadily towards her. Polly stopped, and leaning against the shutters of the grocer's shop on the corner, she told Ellen that she had made her lodging house money 3 times over that day, but had spent it. The two women chatted for around 7 or 8 minutes, during which time, Ellen later remembered, the clock of St. Mary's Church across the road had struck 2:30. Concerned at her friend's intoxicated state, Ellen tried to persuade Polly to come back to the lodging house, but Polly refused, saying that she had no money and that she must make up the cost of her lodgings. Her last words to Ellen were, "It won't be long before I'll be back." Straightening herself up, she tottered to the corner, turned left, and Ellen watched her stagger off unsteadily along Whitechapel Road. At some point in the next hour, Mary met with Jack the Ripper and went with him into the darkness of Bucks Row, a nondescript thoroughfare located behind Whitechapel Station. At around 3:30 a.m, Charles Cross, a carman or delivery driver who worked for Pickford's, left his home here in Dufton Street and began his walk to work. Although we don't know the exact route he was in the habit of following, part of it took him along Bucks Row, the first section of which was lined on its right or north side by warehouse buildings and on its left or south side by a row of 2-storey cottages. Bucks Row is now called Durward Street, and it has changed almost beyond recognition since Charles Cross walked along it that morning. The only building to have survived from the Victorian era is the board school, which still confronts the wayfarer who turns into Durward Street, just as it would have confronted those walking along it in the 19th century. It was around 3:40 a.m. when Charles Cross, having turned into Bucks Row from Brady Street, was walking towards the board school on the north or right-hand side of the street. As he passed a wool warehouse, he caught sight of something in a gateway on the opposite side of the street and veered over to take a closer look. However, as he approached, he saw that it was in fact the prone form of a woman, and he stopped in the roadway. Seconds later, he heard footsteps approaching from the direction he had just come from, and turning, he saw another man, Robert Paul, coming towards him. Cross waited for the other man to catch up, and as he drew level, he stopped him and pointed out the woman lying on the ground. Nervously, the two men approached the silent form, and stooping down, they carried out a cursory examination, but they couldn't make up their minds as to whether she was alive or dead, so they decided that since they were both now late for work, their best course of action was to continue on their way and notify the first policeman they encountered of their find. Shortly after they left the scene, Police Constable Neal passed the gate on his beat and spotted the woman. Shining his lamp on her, he saw blood oozing from a wound in her throat. Other police officers were soon at the scene, one of whom, Constable Thane, went to fetch the nearest doctor, Ralph Llewellyn, who, on his arrival, declared life extinct, carried out a cursory examination, and then ordered that the body be removed to the mortuary, where he said he would make a further examination. At the mortuary, Inspector Spratling turned up to take down the description of the deceased, and lifting up her skirts, he made the horrific discovery that a deep gash ran all the way along her abdomen. She had been disemboweled. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror was underway. Bucks Row has gone through several iterations since that long-ago morning. The name, for example, was changed to Durward Street a few years after the murder, albeit the buildings that lined it survived for almost 100 years. Today, every building except for the board school has disappeared. The murder site itself is situated next to the Durward Street exit from the new Whitechapel station, and few of those who come out of it are aware of the fact that they are passing the very spot where Mary Nichols was brutally murdered. The killer had several possible escape routes from Bucks Row, one of the likeliest being to skirt the board school into the adjacent Winthrop Street and then make his way through Wood's buildings onto Whitechapel Road. Regarding the perpetrator's escape from the scene, the coroner, Win Edwin Baxter, had this to say in his summing up at the inquest into Mary Nichols's death, which was held at the Working Lads Institute, a building that still stands alongside the main entrance to Whitechapel Station. The presence of so many slaughterhouses in the neighbourhood would make the frequenters of this spot familiar with blood-stained clothes and hands, and his appearance might in that way have failed to attract attention while he passed from Bucks Row in the twilight into Whitechapel Road and was lost sight of in the morning's market traffic. Today, Whitechapel Road is as busy as ever it was in the past, and you can see how it would have provided a convenient escape from the scene of what many people believe was the first murder by Jack the Ripper. A week later, with the district still reeling from the shock of yet another murder, on the evening of the 7th of September, a journalist on the East London Advertiser set about penning his copy for the next day's edition. There was a general belief that the murder of Emma Smith that had occurred in April of that year was the work of the same killer, and thus the reporter wrote, "If, as we imagine, there be a murderous lunatic concealed in the slums of Whitechapel, who issues forth to prey upon the defenceless women of the unfortunate class, we have little doubt that he will be captured. The cunning of the lunatic, especially of the criminal lunatic, is well known, but a lunatic of this sort can scarcely remain at large for any length of time in the teeming neighbourhood of Whitechapel. The terror, which since Thursday last has inspired every man and woman in the district, will keep every eye on the watch. A watch should be kept indeed behind the windows in every street in Whitechapel. The murderer must creep out from somewhere. He must patrol the streets in search of his victims. Doubtless he is out night by night, and unless a watch of the strictest be kept, the murder of Thursday will certainly be followed by a fourth." As the newspaper was hitting the streets, over in Dorset Street, Annie Chapman was being ejected from Crossingham's lodging house at number 35 because, just like Mary Nichols a week before, she didn't have the required fourpence to pay for a bed. There were uncorroborated reports in the newspapers that one of the staff at the 10 Bells on Commercial Street had stated that a woman answering Annie's description had been drinking in the pub at 5 o'clock on the morning of the 8th of September when a man in a little skull cap popped his head around the door and called her out. 30 minutes later, Elizabeth Long turned into nearby Hanbury Street from Brick Lane and began walking along its north or right side. She was heading for Spitalfields Market, where she worked as a cart minder. She was adamant that she had heard the clock of the brewery in Brick Lane strike 5:30, making her certain about the time she was in Hanbury Street, although she may have been confused about the timing, as it is possible the clock had in fact struck 5:15. As she passed number 29, she saw a man and a woman talking together on the pavement outside it, standing against the shutters. The man's back was to her, so Mrs. Long didn't see his face, but the woman was facing her, and later, when shown the body of Annie Chapman at the mortuary, she was adamant that that was the woman she had seen. The couple were talking loudly, and she heard the man say, "Will you?" to which the woman replied, "Yes." From that briefly overheard snippet, Mrs. Long deduced that the man had been a foreigner. However, since nothing about them aroused her suspicion, she continued past them and made her way to the market. Number 29, along with the entire north side of Hanbury Street, was demolished in the early 1970s, and the former Truman Brewery building now occupies the site. A few years ago, the number 29 reappeared on the outside of one of the windows, but that too has now gone, and a street food market now does thriving business inside the building, meaning that it is now possible to get reasonably close to the site of the backyard of number 29. At 6 a.m. on the 8th of September, 56-year-old John Davis, who occupied the front room attic of number 29 with his wife Mary and their 3 sons, came down the stairs to set off for Leadenhall Market, where he was employed as a carman. Intending to visit the backyard privy before beginning his journey to work, he turned to make his way along the narrow passage, noticing as he did so that the front street door was wide open and thrown back against the wall. However, since it was common for the door to be left open in this way, he wasn't particularly surprised and proceeded towards the back door, which was shut. Opening it, he was confronted by the sight of the body of a woman lying in the recess between the steps and the fence. Her head was towards the house, and her feet were towards the woodshed, and her clothing was up to her groin. What was lying beside her I cannot describe, he later recalled. It was part of her body. I did not examine the woman. I was too frightened at the dreadful sight. Racing through the passage and out into the street, Davis called to 3 men who were standing nearby. "Men, come here. Here's a sight. A woman must have been murdered." The 4 of them made their way through the passage of number 29 and looked down from the back door to take in the horrific sight. They then all hurried off to raise the alarm and fetch the police. The first police officer to arrive at the scene was Inspector Joseph Chandler, who arrived at 6:20 a.m. A crowd had gathered outside, and the passage was full of people, albeit none of them appeared to have gone into the yard. Chandler immediately sent for the divisional police surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, and then ordered his officers to clear the bystanders from the passage. Having covered the body with some sacking, he awaited the doctor's arrival. I won't go into any detail about the doctor's findings, but it is worth noting that he was certain that Annie Chapman had entered the yard alive and had been murdered where her body was found. Today, the south side of Hanbury Street remains relatively unchanged, and the majority of the buildings were here in 1888 and would certainly be familiar to the Victorian residents. It is, however, difficult to imagine the north side as it would have been at the time. Thankfully, photographs of it exist to show us what it would have looked like. This one, taken from the corner of Wilk Street in the 1930s, is looking east along it, whereas this one, taken by Stuart Evans in the 1960s, shows the front of number 29, from the door of which the killer would have stepped, having carried out his dreadful crime in the backyard of the house. His escape was certainly audacious, since if Elizabeth Long did indeed see him with Annie Chapman at 5:30 a.m, he would have left the building in daylight, with numerous people passing up and down the street, either on their way to work or else returning home. But then less than a minute's walk would have brought him to the very busy and bustling commercial street, where he could easily have blended in with the market workers, who at that time had no idea that yet another ghastly murder had been committed in their very midst. In 2026, people and traffic moved to and fro along Hanbury Street, seemingly oblivious to the darker side of its history, and there is nothing here to remember Annie Chapman and her untimely end, save for an endless stream of Jack the Ripper tours that stand on the approximate site of her murder for a few minutes before moving on to visit the sites of the other crimes, just as we will now do. But before we make our way to the next Whitechapel murder site, we must visit a location that was pivotal to the Jack the Ripper story. This is New Bridge Street in the City of London. At the traffic lights, it passes Ludgate Hill to the right, on the summit of which stands St Paul's Cathedral, and to the left Fleet Street, which at the time of the atrocities was the centre for journalism, with almost all the major newspapers and news agencies having offices on or around it. On New Bridge Street were the offices of the Central News, based at No. 5, the tall cream building to the left of the covered passage. On the 27th of September, 1888, a letter arrived here addressed to the Boss, Central News Office, London City. Couched in boastful, mocking terms and written in red ink, it began, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. Having stated that, I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." The author gloated that he loved his work and that he wanted to start again, warned that they would soon hear of him with his funny little games, and threatened that the next job he did he would clip the ladies' ears off and send to the police officers. Having urged them to keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, the author signed his missive Jack the Ripper, a name that chillingly encapsulated the horror and revulsion that the crimes were generating. Convinced that the letter was a prank, the Central News did nothing with it for 2 days. But on the 29th of September, an employee of the agency, Thomas Bulling, forwarded the letter to Chief Constable Adolphus Frederick Williamson at Scotland Yard, with a covering note that read, "The editor presents his compliments to Mr. Williamson and begs to inform him the enclosed was sent to the Central News 2 days ago and was treated as a joke." Within 24 hours of the letter being sent to the police, the killer struck again and carried out 2 murders in the space of 45 minutes. Desperate for a breakthrough, the Metropolitan Police took the decision to make the missive public, and within days, facsimiles of it and a postcard that arrived at the Central News Office on Monday the 1st of October were appearing in newspapers nationwide. The resultant publicity encouraged hoaxers across the country to reach for their pens, and hundreds of similar prank letters flooded in, many of them bearing the name by which the unknown miscreant would be ever after known, Jack the Ripper. But now let us return to the East End of London and the afternoon of Saturday the 29th of September. Elizabeth Long Liz Stride spent what would be the last afternoon of her life cleaning the rooms in the lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street, where she had lived on and off for the previous 6 years. Search for Flower and Dean Street in 2026 and you will search in vain, for it was demolished in the 1980s and the Flower and Dean estate now occupies its site. Lolsworth Close now follows the line of it, but there is nothing here to remember that this was once one of the most notorious streets in the East End of London, its name synonymous with vice and criminality. On Tuesday the 21st of November 2006, Channel 5 aired Jack the Ripper, the First Serial Killer, which it described as an historic reinvestigation and the latest development in a vast industry dedicated to solving Britain's greatest murder mystery. The programme makers consulted Kim Rosmo of the University of Texas, a pioneer of geographic profiling, a technique that uses previous crimes to calculate where an offender lives. Based on the locations of the killings and possible sightings of the perpetrator, Dr. Rosmo opined that the Ripper was a resident of the square mile area in which he killed, and that he most likely lived in Flower and Dean Street. so it is possible that Jack the Ripper was prowling Flower and Dean Street at 6:30 that Saturday evening, the 29th of September 1888, as Elizabeth Stride finished her chores and was paid sixpence by the deputy lodging-house keeper, Elizabeth Tanner. Liz Stride then headed over to the Queen's Head at the junction of Commercial Street and Fashion Street, the next thoroughfare along from Flower and Dean Street. The building still stands, although it hasn't been a pub for many years, and in 2026 it houses an architectural practice. Having slaked her thirst, Elizabeth headed back to the lodging house at 7 o'clock, where, having readied herself for a night out, she left at around 7:30 p.m. It rained heavily that night, and at 11 p.m, J. Best and John Gardner saw her sheltering in the doorway of the Bricklayers Arms on Settle Street, another building that still stands, although it too is no longer a pub, its upper floors having been turned into flats, whilst the ground floor is now occupied by an office with a fashionable mirrored front door. Liz was in the company of a man who Best and Gardner described as being about 5 foot 5 inches tall. He had a black moustache, sandy eyelashes, and was wearing a black morning suit, together with a billycock hat. Best later recalled that the couple seemed reluctant to go out, and he and Gardner were, he said, astonished at the way the man was hugging and kissing her. Best and Gardner couldn't resist chaffing the couple a little, and called to the woman, "Watch out, that's Leather Apron getting round you." The couple seemed embarrassed by this, and they hurried off through the rain towards Commercial Road. Several witnesses would later come forward to say that they had seen Elizabeth Stride in the company of a man over the course of the next few hours. One of the more important of these was Israel Schwartz, who at 12:45 on the morning of Saturday the 30th of September was heading south along Berner Street from Commercial Road when he saw a man who was walking slightly ahead of him stop to chat with a woman whom Schwartz later insisted had been Elizabeth Stride, who was standing in the gateway of Dutfield's Yard, a little way along on the right side of Berner Street. As Schwartz looked on, the man tried to pull the woman into the road, but she resisted, whereupon the man spun her around and threw her to the ground. Schwartz believed that he was witnessing a domestic dispute, so he crossed Berner Street to avoid becoming involved. As he did so, he noticed a man in the doorway of the Nelson beer shop lighting his pipe. The man who was attacking the woman then shouted out, "Lipski," apparently to the man in the pub doorway, and the second man then appeared to follow Schwartz, who, fearing he was about to be attacked himself, hurried south towards the railway arch. To his relief, his pursuer, if pursuer he was, didn't follow that far. Dutfield's Yard sided onto the International Working Men's Educational Club, the steward of which, Louis Diemschutz, had spent the Saturday hawking cheap jewellery near Crystal Palace. He returned to Berner Street in the early hours of Sunday morning. As he turned into the street from Commercial Road, he looked at the clock in the window of Harris's tobacconists on the east or left corner of the street and saw that it was 1 o'clock. That building still survives, although in the last 2 years it has undergone a total refacing and looks nothing like it did at the time. Continuing along Berner Street, Diemschutz turned his pony and barrow into Dutfield's Yard. As he did so, the pony shied, pulled left, and refused to go any further. Looking to see what had disturbed the animal, Diemschutz noticed something on the ground, so he leant forward and poked at it with his whip. Being unable to move it, he struck a match and saw that it was in fact a woman. His first thought was that it was his wife and that she was drunk, so he went into the club where he found his wife in the ground floor kitchen with several of the members. "There is a woman lying in the yard," he told them, "but I cannot say whether she is drunk or dead." Going upstairs, he told other members that he thought she was drunk. Several of them then accompanied him back into the yard, where on striking another match they saw blood trickling from her neck. It was later discovered that although Liz Stride's throat had been cut, unlike the previous 2 victims, the rest of her body had not been mutilated. This led to the belief that Diemschutz had interrupted her killer before he could carry out the mutilation, although it has been posited that it could also suggest that Elizabeth Stride was the victim of a different perpetrator. Berner Street has now been completely transformed. Even its name has changed, for in 1964 it became Henriques Street. As for Dutfield's Yard, where the body was found, the playground of the Harry Gosling Primary School now occupies its site. There is a good chance that the killer was hiding in the darkness of the yard when Diemschutz made his horrific discovery, and had Deemshits raised the alarm immediately, the Whitechapel murderer may well have been caught. But Deemshits' decision to go and check on his wife gave the murderer a vital few minutes to make his escape. And if you believe that Elizabeth Stride was a victim of Jack the Ripper, then where he headed from Berner Street would become horrifically apparent just 45 minutes later. As Elizabeth Stride was heading out on the Saturday night, Catherine Eddowes had evidently been enjoying the hospitality of the district's pubs for several hours. At around 8:30 p.m. that night, Police Constable Louis Robinson of the City of London Police was walking his beat along Aldgate High Street when he noticed a crowd gathered on one of the pavements, laughing at something. Pushing through them, he found that the source of their amusement was a drunken woman, whom he later identified as Catherine Eddowes, who was entertaining them with an imitation of a fire engine. Having taken a bow, she lay down on the pavement and went to sleep. Constable Robinson asked if any of the onlookers knew who the woman was. None of them did, so the officer hauled her to her feet and propped her up against the shutters of one of the shops. She promptly slid back down onto the pavement. Robinson summoned the assistance of a colleague, Constable George Simmons, and together they manhandled her around to Bishopsgate Police Station. Here, when asked her name, Kate replied, "Nothing." The officers placed her in a cell and left her to sober up. At 9:45 that night, the city jailer, George Hart, came on duty and took over responsibility for the prisoners in the cells. He checked on her several times over the next few hours and each time found that she was sound asleep. However, by 12:15 on the morning of the 30th, she had awoken, and Hart heard her singing softly in the cell. 15 minutes later, she called to him and asked when she was going to be released. "When you can take care of yourself," was Hart's reply. "I can do that now," Catherine shouted back. At 12:55 a.m, he brought her from the cell and told her that she could go. When asked her name and address for the release papers, she gave them as Mary Ann Kelly of 6 Fashion Street. Hart escorted her to the station's side door, which exited onto the dark and narrow Rose Alley, and which still exists alongside the modern Bishopsgate Police Station. As Kate left the station, Hart asked her to shut the door behind her. "All right," she chirped. "Good night, old cock." So saying, she made her way along Rose Alley and turned left along Bishopsgate. She would be dead within the hour. At around 1:30 a.m, City Police Constable Edward Watkins walked his beat through Mitre Square on the City of London's eastern fringe. He had his lantern on and fixed to his belt. He was emphatic that the square had been quite deserted at that time and that no one could have been hiding there without him seeing them. Around 5 minutes later, commercial traveller Joseph Lavender, butcher Joseph Hyam Levy, and furniture dealer Harry Harris, members of the Imperial Club located on Duke Street, now called Duke's Place, left the club and headed in the direction of Church Passage, the southeastern entrance to Mitre Square. As they passed the passage, they saw a man and a woman standing under the gas lamp over the entrance. The woman had her back to the trio, so they didn't see her face, but Lavender later identified Catherine Eddowes' clothing as that worn by the woman. Levy wasn't impressed at the sight of the couple and said to Harris, "Here, I'm off. I don't like the look of those people over there. I don't like going home by myself at this hour of the morning. I don't like passing this class of person." Joseph Lavender, however, was a little less disgusted and glanced briefly at the man as he passed the couple. Despite later claiming that he wouldn't be able to identify the man were he to be confronted with him again, he was later able to provide quite a detailed description of him. He had, he said, the appearance of a sailor, was aged about 30, around 5'9" tall, of medium build, with a fair complexion and a small fair moustache. He sported a reddish handkerchief tied in a knot, wore a pepper and salt loose-fitting jacket, and had on a grey peaked cloth cap. The three men continued on their way, and none of them looked back once they had passed the couple. There was no sign of them 5 minutes later, when City Constable James Harvey walked his beat past Church Passage. He even went down the passage, checking the doors of the premises on either side. However, he stopped short of entering Mitre Square, but walked back down the passage and continued on his beat along Duke Street. At 1:44 a.m, just a few minutes after Harvey had completed his examination of Church Passage, Constable Watkins turned out of Leadenhall Street, headed along Mitre Street and veered right into Mitre Square. Shining his bullseye lamp into the dark recesses of the square, he noticed something in the southwest corner. Approaching, he shone his lamp onto it and saw to his horror that it was in fact the mutilated body of a woman. Recoiling, he raced across the cobbles and burst into Keely and Tong's warehouse on the north side of the square, where George Morris, a retired police officer, was working as a night watchman. "For God's sake, mate," stammered Watkins, "come to my assistance. Here is another woman cut to pieces." Pausing momentarily to get his lamp, Morris followed the officer back across the square, took one look at the body, and raced off along Mitre Street, blowing furiously on his whistle to raise the alarm. Soon, police officers were converging on Mitre Square from all directions, and they began fanning out in search of the killer. But their efforts proved fruitless. The murderer, it seemed, had melted into thin air, and nobody had seen a thing. George Morris confessed himself totally baffled as to how such a brutal crime could have been committed so close to his place of work without him hearing a sound. He could hear the footsteps of the policeman as he passed on his beat every quarter of an hour, the Illustrated Police News reported. It was only the other night that he remarked to some policeman that he wished the butcher would come round Mitre Square and he would give him a doing. Yet the butcher had come, and he was perfectly ignorant of it. In recent years, Mitre Square has been completely redeveloped, and modern offices now tower over it. It has also lost its name, and there is no sign here anymore to tell you that you are in Mitre Square. However, it is unique among the murder sites in that it is the only one at which there is any official recognition of the crime having taken place here, with this information board providing details about the murder of Catherine Eddowes. Whereas we can't be 100% certain as to where the murderer went after the other crimes, with Mitre Square, we do at least know what direction he went in. Just over an hour after Watkins discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes, Police Constable Alfred Long was walking his beat along Goulston Street. As he passed the entrance of the staircase that led to number 118 to 119 Wentworth Model dwellings, he noticed something lying on the ground. Stooping down, he discovered that it was a blood-stained portion of a woman's apron. It later transpired that it was in fact part of Catherine Eddowes' apron that had been taken from Mitre Square by her killer, seemingly so that he could wipe his hands and the blade of his knife on it. Since Long was emphatic that it had not been there when he passed the doorway on his beat at 2:20 a.m, it would appear that the murderer dropped it in the doorway as he fled through the streets, having made his escape from Mitre Square. Long's first thought was that someone may have been attacked and could be lying dead or injured on a staircase or landing inside the dwellings, so he stood up intending to search the block. As he did so, he noticed a message scrawled in chalk on the inner door jamb above the apron. It read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Summoning a fellow officer to guard the doorway, Long hurried to Commercial Street Police Station to report his find and to hand the piece of apron in. Soon, detectives from the Metropolitan Police were gathering around the doorway and were gazing at the graffito with great trepidation. In a matter of hours, the Petticoat Lane Street Market would get underway in the surrounding streets, and mindful of the fact that in the aftermath of the murder of Annie Chapman there had been a great deal of anti-Semitic unrest, they were fearful that if the message was still there when people began arriving for the market, there would be another outbreak of anti-Jewish feeling in the neighbourhood. They therefore wanted to erase the graffito sooner rather than later. However, the murder of Catherine Eddowes had taken place in the City of London and was therefore being investigated by a separate police force, the City of London Police, detectives from which had soon arrived at the doorway. They wanted the message preserved until it was light in order that a photograph could be taken of it. As the officers from the two forces argued over whether or not the writing should be erased, Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, arrived at the doorway at between 5 and 5:30 a.m. Since the doorway itself was on Metropolitan Police territory, his word was final, and he concurred with the view of his detectives and gave the order that the message should be erased without further delay. And, much to the consternation of the city detectives, this was done before any photograph could be taken. Warren would later defend his decision. "I do not hesitate to say that if the writing had been left, there would have been an onslaught upon the Jews, and lives would have probably been lost. My personal opinion is that the graffito was already in the doorway, so photographing it would have had no benefit, And it is worth noting that, thanks to the subsequent controversy over Warren's decision, the message was widely reported in the newspapers, and no onslaught against the Jews actually occurred. The real clue in the doorway is the piece of apron, as this tells us which direction the killer was heading in, and lends credence to the possibility that he resided in the area. It is worth noting that Flower and Dean Street was just a few blocks east of the doorway, a matter of a few minutes' walk away, so perhaps that was where Jack the Ripper's bolt hole was located, and that was where he was heading after Goulston Street. But we have lingered long enough at the doorway, and we must now make our way to the site of the most gruesome of all Jack the Ripper's crimes. Although no Whitechapel murders occurred in October, the newspaper coverage about Jack the Ripper increased dramatically. The police presence in the district intensified noticeably, not least because they undertook a massive search of the slums. Door-to-door inquiries were made, the common lodging houses were visited by detectives, and over 2,000 lodgers were questioned, as were sailors coming into and out of the London docks. Enquiries were also made at 76 butchers and slaughterhouses, and the characters of those who worked in them were ascertained. Jack the Ripper was the talk of the land. He was nowhere, and he was everywhere, his name dominating the pages of newspapers all over the country. Letters purporting to come from him continued to pour into the police, newspapers, and anyone who found themselves in the public eye, the most infamous one being the From Hell letter to Mr. George Lusk, which he received on the evening of Tuesday the 16th of October, and which was accompanied by a foul-smelling piece of kidney which the writer claimed he had taken from the body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. I've made a full video on the From Hell letter, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. Yet, despite all this fervid activity, the Ripper remained at large. But with no murders, by this particular killer at least, having taken place throughout the whole of October, by the end of the month the people of the East End began to relax, believing that their nightmare was over. The murderer, though, was merely biding his time, and in early November he struck again, the scene of his next outrage being Miller's Court, a grim cul-de-sac located off Dorset Street in Spitalfields, where he carried out the horrific murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Dorset Street had a terrible reputation for vice and criminality, and it would later acquire the unenviable sobriquet of the worst street in London. Nothing now survives of this once infamous thoroughfare, its site being occupied by a modern office and retail complex, although to the west the former Providence Row night refuge still looks down on what would have been the western entrance into Dorset Street. Across from what was once the opposite end of Dorset Street, the magnificent Hawksmoor Church of Christchurch Spitalfields still stands. It is a soaring white edifice that dominates its surroundings today, just as it did at the time of the murders, and it is a somewhat sobering thought that all of Jack the Ripper's victims would have looked up at this building. Within the office complex there is an inner court, where you can stand and try and get an idea of the line that Dorset Street once followed, although I must confess that I am sceptical about the oft-made claim that brass markers on the ground correspond with its line and width. In the early hours of Friday the 9th of November, George Hutchinson met Mary Kelly on Commercial Street, the busy thoroughfare that ran past the eastern end of Dorset Street towards Whitechapel High Street or Shoreditch, depending on which direction you happen to be travelling along it. She asked him to lend her sixpence, but he told her that he was spent out. Laughing that she'd have to find it some other way, Mary continued along Commercial Street, where a man coming from the opposite direction touched her on the shoulder, and she started laughing. Hutchinson heard Mary say, "All right," to which the man replied, "You'll be all right for what I have told you." They then started walking back along Commercial Street, and they passed Hutchinson, who was by then standing under the lamppost outside the Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion Street. Here they crossed Commercial Street, turned along Dorset Street, and entered Miller's Court. Hutchinson followed at a distance, and having watched them go into Miller's Court, he waited opposite for almost an hour before leaving the scene. At 10:45 on the Friday morning, Mary Kelly's landlord, John McCarthy, was in his shop at 27 Dorset Street. Mary Kelly owed him 29 shillings in rent arrears, so McCarthy told his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to go to her room and demand the rent. Making his way through the arched passage of Miller's Court, Bowyer knocked twice on the door of number 13. There was no answer. So he went round to what he knew was a broken window pane, pushed aside the makeshift covering that had been placed over it, and looked into the gloomy room. Seconds later, an ashen-faced Bowyer was racing back through the passage. He burst into McCarthy's shop. "Governor," he stammered, I knocked on the door and could not make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood." The two men hurried back to the room where McCarthy looked through the window and saw a sight that would haunt him to his dying day. "I had heard much of the Whitechapel murders," he later told a journalist, "but I never expected to see a sight such as this. I pray to God that I may never see such a sight again. It looked more like the work of a devil than the work of a man." The police were sent for, and they were soon milling around outside the room, albeit it would be several hours before they would actually go inside. Not one police officer or doctor who saw the awful glut in Miller's Court would ever forget it, and looking at the crime scene photo that was taken of the mutilated body on the bed, you can't help but agree wholeheartedly with John McCarthy's assessment that it did indeed look like the work of a devil. What happened to Jack the Ripper once he had walked away from Miller's Court has been the source of endless speculation ever since. Did he die soon after the murder of Mary Kelly? Was he incarcerated either in a prison or an asylum? Did he leave the country and continue his murderous spree elsewhere? Did he simply stop and live out the rest of his days as a seemingly ordinary and respectable member of society? The truth is, we do not and never will know his true identity, and the only certainty we have about him now is that he is long dead. And so we come to the end of our wander around Jack the Ripper's London as it is in 2026. As you have seen, pockets of the Victorian East End still survive, although it must be said that they are becoming fewer and fewer with every passing year. Today's Whitechapel is a bustling, vibrant, multicultural and lively enclave, and is far removed from the abyss of poverty, vice and criminality that the rest of Victorian Britain perceived it to be in the 19th century. Nonetheless, it can be quite a chilling experience to stand amidst the modern buildings that now occupy the murder sites and imagine the horrors that occurred there all those years ago, albeit the modernity of the locations is somewhat at odds with their dark past. The East End as a whole is changing at a rapid pace, and the widespread gentrification that has been going on for the best part of 40 years continues unabated. Yet people continue to be drawn here by the stories of Martha Tabram, Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. They come from all over the world to stand at the sites of their murders, oblivious to the toings and froings of the residents and the workers, some of whom occasionally cast curious or even contemptuous glances towards these true crime enthusiasts. But whether people like it or not, Jack the Ripper is a part of the East End's rich history, and his story shines a light on a few months in the latter half of the 19th century when he held the whole of the country in a grip of terror, horror, and intrigue. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you found it informative. If you have, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It really does help. As always, I'd be delighted to see your opinions and thoughts in the comments section below, so please do discuss the case and make any observations you might have. But for now, until we meet again in the dark labyrinth of Victorian London's true crime underworld, stay safe.